The hammer came down on a roan stallion with a blaze like lightning down his nose, and Charles Cooper had no idea he had just purchased the beginning of his whole life. The year was 1878, and the town of Millhaven, Texas, sat in the middle of the western dust like a sun-bleached bone left in the road. It was a cattle town, a rough-edged, whiskey-smelling, hard-working kind of place where men wore their hats low and their opinions loud, and where every auction day brought the whole county together in a crush of shoulders and tobacco smoke and the particular smell of animals and ambition. The livestock auction was held on the second Saturday of each month in the big yard behind the grain merchant's building, and on this particular Saturday in October, the crowd was thicker than usual because the Garrison estate was being settled. Everyone in Millhaven knew about Thomas Garrison. He had been a good man, a farmer and part-time horse breeder who had built a modest operation on 40 acres east of town before a fever took him in August, leaving behind a wife, 2 children, and a considerable number of debts that his widow, Eudora Garrison, had been quietly trying to manage ever since. The estate sale had drawn people from 3 counties over, partly because Thomas had owned some fine animals, and partly because people in small western towns are as drawn to tragedy as they are to celebration, and the auctioning of a dead man's goods carries a kind of grim theater that no one wants to admit they have come to witness. Charles Cooper had come purely for the horse. He was 34 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men who work outside in the Texas sun become weathered, with dark eyes and hair that had gone silver at the temples before his time, and hands that were calloused and sure. He ran a spread of about 200 acres to the north of Millhaven, raising cattle mostly, but with a genuine passion for horses that bordered on the devotional. He had heard about Garrison's roan stallion, a horse named Compass, from 3 different people before the auction notice had even been posted, and he had come with money in his coat pocket and a clear, specific intention. Compass was extraordinary. There was simply no other word for him. He stood 16 hands at the shoulder, with a chest like a barrel and legs that were long and clean and perfectly conformed. His coat was a deep mahogany roan that shifted color in the sunlight from brown to copper to something almost purple, and the white blaze on his face ran straight and bold from his poll to his nostrils. He moved through the auction yard with the contained authority of an animal that knew his own value, and every man in the crowd pressed forward when he was let out. The bidding was brisk and competitive, and Charles held back until the weaker bidders dropped away, and then he drove the price up steadily until the last competing bidder, a rancher from Abilene named Fowler who had more ego than sense, finally shook his head and stepped back. The hammer came down. Charles Cooper owned Compass for the sum of $68, which was a great deal of money in 1878, and he paid it without flinching and arranged for the horse to be delivered to his ranch the following morning. He did not see the woman watching from behind the fence post. Eudora Garrison had stood apart from the main crowd for most of the auction. She was 31 years old, and she had the kind of beauty that comes from strong bones and clear eyes rather than softness, the kind of beauty that grief makes more striking rather than diminishing, because it strips away everything decorative and leaves only the essential. Her hair was dark brown and pinned back severely, and she wore a black dress that had been pressed and mended until it was as presentable as a morning dress could be, and her jaw was set in the expression of a woman who has decided not to cry in public no matter what it costs her. She had 2 children at home, 7-year-old Nathaniel and 5-year-old Clara, being watched by her neighbor Mrs. Finch. She had 40 acres with a leaking roof, a small vegetable garden, 6 laying hens, and debts totaling more than $200. The estate lawyer, a thin, officious man named Prout, had advised her that selling the livestock was the most immediate path to reducing the debt burden, and Eudora had agreed because she had no other choice. She had agreed about everything except Compass. She had gone to Prout 3 times. She had told him that Compass was not just a horse, that Thomas had bred him from a mare he had raised from a foal, that he had poured 4 years of careful, patient, loving work into that animal, that Compass was the one thing on the property that felt like Thomas was still somehow present. Prude had listened politely and told her that Compass was also the most valuable asset in the estate, and that the creditors had a legal claim that superseded her sentimental attachment. And the third time she had come to his office, he had simply not been there when she arrived. So she stood behind the fence post and watched Charles Cooper buy her husband's horse for $68, and she felt something break inside her that was separate from grief. It was a specific kind of helplessness, the helplessness of a person who has done everything right and still lost, and it made her want to do something reckless. She did not go home and cry. She went to find out where Charles Cooper's ranch was. She asked Mrs. Alderman at the dry goods store, who knew everyone's business and shared it freely. Charles Cooper, Mrs. Alderman told her, ran the Cooper Ranch on the North Road, about 4 miles out of town. He was a quiet man, kept to himself mostly, had come to Millhaven about 6 years ago from somewhere in Colorado. He was not married. He employed 2 hands, brothers named Will and Pete Dawson, who were decent enough young men. He had a reputation for fair dealing and for producing good cattle, and also for being somewhat particular about his horses. Eudora thanked her and went home to her children, and after she had fed them supper and heard their prayers and put them to bed, she sat at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low and thought very carefully about what she was going to do. She was going to ride out to the Cooper Ranch first thing in the morning and ask for Compass back. She rehearsed the conversation in her head. She would be direct and reasonable. She would explain the situation. She would offer to pay something, even though she had almost nothing, or perhaps arrange some kind of trade. She was a decent hand at sewing and could bake bread that people paid for at the church sales. She could offer labor. She could offer something. She could not simply accept that Compass was gone because a lawyer she barely knew had decided a debt was more important than a life. She woke before the children and was dressed, and had the mule saddled while the sky was still a dark blue promise in the east. She told Mrs. Finch, who came over early most mornings to help with the children since she had lost her own husband 2 years before and found the company helpful, that she would be back by mid-morning, and she rode out on the mule with her back straight and her heart hammering in a way that she told herself was anger and not anxiety. The North Road in early October was beautiful in a way that felt almost offensive to her mood. The mesquite trees had turned, and the grasses along the road were golden, and the sky was the specific shade of blue that only happens in Texas in autumn, and the morning air was cold and clear and smelled of cedar and distance. The mule, whose name was Amos and who had a profound personal philosophy of taking everything at a walk, proceeded northward with dignified indifference to her urgency. The Cooper Ranch announced itself with a good fence first, a cedar post fence that was straight and solid and well-maintained, which Eudora noted involuntarily because Thomas's fences had always been the thing that needed attention. The gate was open, and she rode through it along a packed dirt lane that was lined with cottonwood trees, their leaves shaking gold in the morning light. And then the house appeared around a curve, and she pulled Amos to a stop and looked at it. It was a solid house, built of limestone in the way that the people who had been in Texas long enough to learn from the land built, with a covered porch running the full width of the front and 2 chimneys and windows that were large enough to let in real light. It was not grand, but it was carefully made, and there were flowers in pots along the porch rail, which surprised her for reasons she could not immediately articulate. There was a barn to the left, newer than the house, painted red, with the doors standing open to the morning, and she could hear horses moving inside it. She dismounted and tied Amos to the fence post by the gate, and she walked up the path to the front porch, and she knocked. The door opened, and Charles Cooper stood there in shirt-sleeves and suspenders with a coffee mug in his hand, and his dark eyes wide with the mild surprise of a man who does not often receive visitors at 7 in the morning. He was taller than she had noticed at the auction, and his face had a quality she had not expected, an openness, a kind of unguarded attentiveness that made him look younger than the silver at his temples suggested. He looked at her for a moment. "Good morning," he said. "Mr. Cooper," she said, and her voice was steady, which cost her something. "My name is Eudora Garrison. I believe you purchased a horse yesterday that belonged to my late husband." Something shifted in his expression. Not defensiveness exactly, more like recognition, the look of a person who has been thinking about a thing and suddenly finds himself confronting it directly. "Mrs. Garrison," he said. "Yes, please come in." "I would rather conduct this conversation where I can see the horse," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those attentive dark eyes, and then he nodded and set his coffee mug on the porch rail. "All right," he said. "Follow me." He led her around the side of the house toward the barn, and she followed him with her shoulders squared and her hands folded in front of her, composing her argument as she walked. She had the whole speech prepared. She knew what she was going to say. She walked into the barn and saw a compass, and all the prepared words left her completely. The roan stallion was in the largest stall, and Charles Cooper had not yet had him for 12 hours, but the horse was already settled, already standing comfortably with his head over the stall door, already looking at them both with the calm, intelligent gaze that Eudora had known for 4 years. He recognized her. She could see it in the way his ears came forward and his nostrils flared, and he made the particular soft sound, not quite a whinny but something lower and more personal, that Thomas had always called his greeting. She put her hand on his nose and he pressed into her palm, and she had to stand very still for a moment and breathe carefully through her nose so that she would not cry. Charles Cooper stood back and gave her that moment without comment or intrusion, which she noted. "Mr. Cooper," she said at last, her voice only slightly unsteady, "I understand that the purchase was legal. I am not here to dispute that, but I am here to ask you to consider selling him back to me." "What would you offer?" he asked, not unkindly. She turned to face him. "I know I cannot match what you paid. I have a little money set aside, perhaps $15, and I can offer labor. I'm a skilled seamstress and I bake bread and I can do whatever kind of work you might need done. I can also offer you the first foal if he covers one of my mares in the spring, assuming I can keep the mares, which I intend to try to do." He was watching her with that same attentive expression, his arms crossed loosely, his head slightly tilted. "Why this horse specifically?" he asked. "You had 3 other horses in the auction." "Those were working horses," she said. "Compass was Thomas's. He bred him and raised him from his dam, who was a horse Thomas loved when he was young. He spent 4 years training him. Compass is the she stopped." She was not going to say that the horse was the last thing she had that felt like Thomas was still present, because that was true, but it was also too much to say to a stranger. "He is important," she finished simply. Charles Cooper was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Compass and then he looked at her, and she could see something happening in his expression, some kind of internal conversation that she was not privy to. "Mrs. Garrison," he said at last, "I am not going to sell Compass back to you." Her chin came up. "Mr. Cooper." "I'm not going to sell him back to you," he repeated quietly, "because I don't think you should have to buy back something that was yours to begin with." She stared at him. "I beg your pardon." He uncrossed his arms and put his hands in his pockets and looked at her with a directness that was not aggressive but was entirely honest. "I paid $68 for this horse at a legal auction," he said. "And every bit of that money went to settle debts that were largely not your fault, from what I understand, because Thomas Garrison's creditors were men who charged ruinous interest, and the estate lawyer was not as careful as he should have been with how he represented your interests. I know that because I asked some questions after the auction, and I don't like what I found out." Eudora was utterly still. "How do you know anything about my husband's debts?" "I know Jacob Prout," he said flatly, "and I know that he holds a personal financial interest in 2 of the debts he was supposed to be managing impartially on your behalf, which is not legal and which I intend to make trouble about if you will allow me to." The barn was quiet except for the sound of horses breathing and the sparrows in the rafters, and Eudora Garrison stood in the straw and gold morning light, and looked at this man she had not known yesterday, and felt the ground shift under her feet in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the strange, unsteady feeling of someone offering you help you did not know you were allowed to ask for. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "Because it is wrong," he said simply. "And because I bought a horse that should not have been in that auction, and I would like to put that right if I can." She looked at him for a long moment. "You could simply return the horse and walk away." "I could," he agreed, "but I don't think that solves your actual problem. I think your actual problem is Jacob Prout and the interest those creditors have charged, and the fact that 40 acres of good farmland should not be lost because a man died of fever at 40 years old." "I am not a charity case," she said, and there was heat in her voice because she needed there to be. "I can see that," he said, and his voice was steady and completely without condescension. "I am not offering charity. I am offering to stand beside you while you fight for what is yours, which is a different thing. And the horse," he added, glancing at Compass, "stays here where he is safe and well fed until we sort the rest of it out, unless you would rather take him now and try to manage everything else alone." She thought about her leaking roof. She thought about the 40 acres with the fence that needed repair, and the well that was going shallow, and the 2 children she had to feed through the winter, and the $15 she had been hoarding in the flour canister. She thought about Thomas, who would have been furious about Jacob Prout, who had been a man with a very strong sense of justice and a very short patience for dishonesty. "I would like to know exactly what you know about Jacob Prout," she said. Charles Cooper allowed himself a small, brief smile. "Come up to the house," he said. "I'll make more coffee." They sat at his kitchen table for 2 hours. It was a good kitchen, clean and simply furnished, with a cast iron stove and a window that looked out at the cottonwood trees and shelves of plain crockery, and a few books on a ledge near the door. It felt like a room that belonged to a person who lived carefully and purposefully, rather than one who merely inhabited a space, and Eudora noted this too, without knowing why she was cataloging these details. Charles told her what he had learned. He knew a lawyer in Millhaven, a man named Fletcher Hale, who was honest and had handled several land disputes and estate cases. Charles had spoken to him briefly at the auction because he had been uneasy about some of what he had heard regarding how the Garrison estate had been handled. Fletcher Hale believed that Jacob Prout's undisclosed financial interest in 2 of the estate's debts constituted a conflict of interest that could be challenged in court, and that if it were successfully challenged, those 2 debts, which together amounted to over $120 of the outstanding amount, might be reduced or even dismissed. Additionally, Charles had looked carefully at the terms of the debt agreements and believed that the interest charged exceeded the legal maximum under Texas law. Eudora listened to all of this and said very little, which was not because she had nothing to say, but because she was thinking hard, and because she had learned, in the years of managing a household that was often on a financial edge, to collect all information before she responded to it. When he had finished, she asked several specific and intelligent questions about the legal process, the timeline, the potential costs, and the probability of success, and he answered them as honestly as he could, acknowledging what he did not know and what was uncertain. "Fletcher Hale's services will cost something," she said. "I will cover it," Charles said. She looked at him with her clear, serious eyes. "Why?" she said again, because this was the question she could not let go of. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee mug in his hands. "Because I was at that auction," he said, "and I saw you standing behind the fence post. I did not know who you were then, but I saw your face when the hammer came down. And I bought that horse knowing something was wrong about the situation, even before I knew the specifics, and then I went home and thought about it all night, and in the morning I had already decided to do something about it before you even showed up at my door." There was a quality of silence in the kitchen after he said that, a particular quality, intimate and serious. "I am not in a position to accept generosity I cannot repay," Eudora said carefully. "Then don't think of it as generosity," he said. "Think of it as a man doing the correct thing because it is correct. You do not owe me anything for that." She looked at him for a long time. He looked back without discomfort, patient and straightforward, and she thought that she had met very few people in her life who could sit in a silence like that without needing to fill it. "All right," she said at last. "Tell me how to speak with Fletcher Hale." The meeting with Fletcher Hale happened 3 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon when Mrs. Finch was with the children, and the sky was overcast in a way that made the town of Millhaven look gray and deliberate. Fletcher Hale was a compact, precise man of about 50 with reading glasses and a habit of arranging papers on his desk in perfectly parallel lines, and he listened to Eudora tell her story with his hands folded and his eyes sharp, and he asked questions that told her he had already been briefed by Charles and was now forming his own independent assessment. Charles Cooper sat to the side of the room and said almost nothing. He had come because he had offered to, and because he could provide some of the documentation he had reviewed, but he made no attempt to speak for her or to guide her narrative, and she was more grateful for that than she could easily have said. Fletcher Hale believed they had a strong case. He was careful not to promise certainty, but he used phrases like favorable grounds and clear precedent, and I have seen worse situations resolved successfully, which from a lawyer of his manner was practically a guarantee. He would file a formal complaint with the circuit court and request an examination of the estate administration. In the meantime, he would write to the primary creditors informing them that the debt agreements were under legal review. Eudora walked out of Fletcher Hale's office into the gray October afternoon and stood on the plank sidewalk feeling something she had not felt in months, something clean and forward-looking, like the first hint of spring in cold air. Charles was beside her, buttoning his coat against the chill. "Thank you," she said. "It was nothing," he said. "It was not nothing," she said firmly. "Please don't say it was nothing." He looked at her with those dark eyes. "All right," he said. "You're welcome." She almost smiled. She did not quite smile, but the corner of her mouth moved, and he saw it, and something in his own expression went quiet and warm in a way that he hoped she had not noticed because he was not yet sure what to do with it. In the weeks that followed, the case proceeded through the slow machinery of the circuit court, and Eudora Garrison's life continued to be what it was, which was hard and full and entirely her own. She managed the 40 acres as best she could, making decisions about the farm that Thomas had always made, consulting with her neighbor Mr. Beale about the winter wheat, and patching the roof herself with materials she bought from the lumber merchant with carefully rationed money. Nathaniel, who was 7 and possessed of the solemn gravity of a child who has understood that something important has changed without being told all the details, helped her with the chickens and the garden, and Clara, who was 5 and resilient with the depth that small children sometimes have, largely continued being Clara, which involved a great deal of singing to herself and a strong daily argument against wearing shoes. Charles Cooper came by on a Wednesday with Will and Pete Dawson and 3 extra fence posts and fixed the long stretch of pasture fencing on the east side of the property that had been leaning toward collapse since July. He arrived before she was fully awake, and by the time she came out with coffee, he and the Dawson brothers had already set 2 posts. She stood on the porch and looked at this scene for a moment and felt something complicated, something that was gratitude and discomfort and an emotion she did not name to herself. "I did not ask for this," she said from the porch. "No," he agreed, pausing his work to look up at her. "The fence needed doing and my hands had a free morning." Purely practical, she repeated with a dryness that was not quite sarcasm. "I could take them away and you can look at that fence fall down if you prefer," he offered, completely serious. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Drink your coffee before it gets cold," she said, and went back inside, and she heard something she suspected was a laugh from the direction of the fence line, but she was not going to investigate. He stayed for noon dinner. She had not invited him, but she fed him because it was what you did when men had worked on your property, and because she had made a pot of bean soup and a corn bread, and there was enough. He ate with quiet, genuine appreciation and talked to Nathaniel about horses, a topic that made the boy light up in a way Eudora had not seen since before Thomas died, and listened to Clara explain her theory about why the hens laid fewer eggs in October, which Clara explained was because hens did not like the color of October, which was an opinion she held with total confidence. "That is fascinating," Charles said to Clara, with complete seriousness. "I know," Clara agreed. Eudora watched this from across the table and felt the complicated feeling again, deeper this time. He came back the following Saturday with a cartload of timber because the loft in the barn needed shoring up. He came back the Saturday after that with tools to fix the shallot well, something she had not mentioned to him, but that she suspected Will Dawson had passed on through the network of information that moved between ranches and farms faster than any telegraph. She confronted him about this directly, standing in the yard with her arms crossed and the autumn wind moving her hair across her face. "I notice you seem to have a great deal of free Saturdays," she said. He took his hat off and ran his hand through his dark hair in what she was beginning to recognize was his characteristic gesture when he was slightly amused but trying not to show it. "My property is well maintained," he said. "And mine is not," she said, and there was a complicated edge to her voice that was not accusation exactly but was not completely comfortable either. "Your property," he said carefully, meeting her eyes, "is the property of a woman who has been widowed for 2 months and has 2 children and a legal battle on her hands and 40 acres to run alone. It is not a character failing that some things need doing." She looked at him. The wind moved her hair again. She pushed it back impatiently. "What is it that you want, Mr. Cooper?" she asked, and her voice was honest and direct in the way that people are direct when they have stopped rehearsing. "Because you are not a man who does things without a reason, and I would like to know yours." He was quiet for a moment. He turned his hat in his hands. The wind moved between them. "Honestly," he said, "please." "I am not entirely sure," he said. "I know that I think about this farm and these children and their mother more than I have thought about anything in a good many years. I know that when I am here things feel more purposeful than when I am not. And I know that I am aware that you are 2 months out of losing your husband, and I am not a man who would push where he isn't wanted. So I am trying to be useful without being intrusive, and apparently I am not managing the balance correctly." Eudora was very still for a moment. The admission was so plain and so honest that it was almost startling, like a bright light in a room you expected to be dim. "You are not intrusive," she said finally, and her voice was quiet. "But," he said, "but I need to know that I am managing," she said. "I need to know that the decisions are mine and the work is mine and that I am not," she paused, looking for the right word. "Dependent," he said gently. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "I understand that," he said. "I am not trying to take anything over. I am just available, for whatever that is worth." She looked at him for a long, considering moment. The yard was quiet and golden around them, the last warmth of the autumn sun making everything look like something worth keeping. "Fix the well," she said. "I'll make dinner." The slow smile that moved across his face then was a different thing from the brief smiles she had seen before, and it made him look very different, younger and unguarded, and she turned away quickly and walked back toward the house with her heart beating in a way she did not examine. The legal case reached its first significant moment in November when Fletcher Hale filed his formal complaint and Jacob Prout, confronted with the documentation of his conflicts of interest, made the particular mistake of nervous men everywhere and attempted to preemptively settle, which only confirmed what everyone had suspected and satisfied no one. Fletcher Hale pushed hard. The circuit judge, a stern man named Calloway who had very little patience for lawyers who enriched themselves through their clients' misfortunes, granted a full examination of the estate accounts. Eudora was summoned to testify, and she went to the courthouse on a cold November morning in her best dress with her hair carefully pinned and her testimony perfectly prepared. and she delivered it in a clear, precise, completely steady voice, while Jacob Prout sat across the room looking at the floor. Charles sat in the gallery. He had asked if she wanted him there, and she had said yes, which had cost her something and also felt entirely right. And when she looked up once in the middle of her testimony, she found his dark eyes steady on her and felt less alone in a way that was entirely new. Judge Calloway took the matter under advisement and rendered his decision 11 days later. Jacob Prout had acted in clear violation of his fiduciary duty, and the 2 debts in which he held undisclosed interests were invalidated. Additionally, the other debt agreements were to be recalculated at the legal interest ceiling, which reduced their total considerably. The remaining debts at fair rates came to approximately $60, a sum that was large but manageable, a sum that did not require selling the farm. Eudora sat in Fletcher Hale's office and read the ruling twice, and then she folded her hands in her lap and sat quietly for a moment while Fletcher explained the next steps, and when he was finished, she thanked him and walked out into the November street. Charles was waiting on the sidewalk. He had not come to the ruling reading because she had not asked him to, and she noticed that he had not inserted himself. She looked at him. "We won," she said. Something moved across his face, something that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it, something warmer. "Good," he said. "The farm is mine," she said. "Properly, legally, entirely mine." "Good," he said again, and this time the word carried a different weight. She stood on the November sidewalk with the cold air on her face and looked at this man who had put $68 into an auction to buy a horse and had then spent 2 months quietly making things right. And she felt something she had been trying not to feel for approximately 6 weeks, something that she had been telling herself was gratitude and admiration and respect, and all the reasonable, safe things it could be. "Compass," she said. He shook his head. "He is yours. He has always been yours. Come get him whenever you like." "You have been keeping him for 2 months," she said, "feeding him, exercising him." "I enjoyed it," he said. "He is a magnificent horse. Your husband knew what he was doing." She looked away for a moment. The sky was the pale, flat white of late November, and the street was busy with the ordinary traffic of a Wednesday morning. She thought about Thomas, who had been a good man, a steady and kind man who had loved her in the comfortable, reliable way of a person you have built a life with and who you expect to grow old beside. She thought about the grief of August and September, which had been deep and real. She thought about standing behind the fence post at the auction with the particular helplessness of a person whose future is being decided without her input. She thought about a kitchen table and 2 cups of coffee and a man who had asked, before anything else, exactly what had gone wrong and what could be done about it. "I would like to come get him on Saturday," she said, "and I would like to bring the children." "Saturday," he said. "I will have coffee ready." She came on Saturday with Nathaniel and Clara, Nathaniel sitting behind her on Amos with his thin arms around her waist, and Clara tucked in front, all 3 of them proceeding up the Cottonwood Lane in the early winter morning with the trees bare now, their branches silver and precise against the cold blue sky. Charles was on the porch when they arrived, coffee in hand as promised, and there was a ranch hand she had not met before. A compact older man named Sibo who turned out to have a particular gift for making children feel at home, and who immediately took Nathaniel off to see a foal that had been born 2 weeks prior, which was a tactical kindness that Eudora appreciated enormously. Clara, who had no intention of going anywhere without her mother, stayed on the porch and positioned herself between the 2 adults with the strategic instinct of a 5-year-old. Who has decided that she is participating in whatever is happening. Charles brought a smaller cup of cocoa for Clara, having thought ahead, and Clara received it with the magnanimous grace of someone conferring honor rather than accepting it, and informed him that she had decided his porch was a very good porch. "Highest praise," he said seriously. "It is," Clara confirmed. Eudora caught his eye over Clara's head, and the look that passed between them was swift and warm and private. The look of two people who share a joke that cannot be spoken aloud because it would reveal too much. And she looked away first because she was not yet ready to look at it directly. They brought Compass home that afternoon, Nathaniel riding the roan stallion with a luminous expression of solemn joy, while Charles walked beside with a lead rope that was entirely unnecessary, because Compass was as gentle as a church deacon. And Eudora rode Amos and Clara rode in front of her, and the little procession went south down the north road in the flat winter light. And it was one of the finest things Eudora had seen in a long time. She invited Charles Cooper to Christmas dinner. She agonized over this decision for a full week before she made it, because inviting a man to Christmas dinner was not a neutral gesture in 1878 in a small Texas town, and because she was aware that people in Millhaven were already talking, as they talk in small towns with the particular energy of people who have decided that a widow's private life is public information. She had heard from Mrs. Alderman, who had told her in the well-meaning tone of someone delivering a warning wrapped in gossip, that certain people thought Charles Cooper was paying a great deal of attention to Thomas Garrison's widow, and certain people thought it was too soon, and certain people thought it was actually rather generous and understandable given the circumstances, and the whole town was in discussion about it. Eudora had said calmly that she would appreciate it if people would mind their business, and Mrs. Alderman had looked at once scandalized and impressed. She invited Charles Cooper to Christmas dinner because she wanted to, and because Nathaniel had asked 4 times if Mr. Cooper would be coming, and Clara had asked twice, and Eudora had decided that her children's happiness was a more important consideration than the conversation of people who had never had to stand behind a fence post at an auction and watch their husband's horse sold. He came on Christmas Day with a roast chicken from his own yard and a jar of apple preserves and a carved wooden horse for Nathaniel and a hair ribbon for Clara. And because he was not a foolish man, a simple handkerchief for Eudora, which was a gift so carefully calibrated to be appropriate and thoughtful without overstepping that she laughed when she opened it, a real laugh, sudden and genuine, and he looked startled by it and then delighted. "Is that funny?" he asked. "It is the most correctly chosen gift I have ever received," she said. "That's a strange thing to be proud of," he said, but he was smiling. The day was warm and easy in the way that good days sometimes are when everyone present has decided to simply be in the moment rather than worrying about what it means. Nathaniel showed Charles everything on the farm with proprietorial pride. The chickens and the vegetable garden now put to sleep for winter, the barn and the horses, the east fence that Charles had helped fix, pointing at it with the satisfaction of a boy who has decided that this man is trustworthy. Clara performed for them both, a song she had composed herself about a bear who was also a farmer, which had 5 verses of increasing absurdity and was delivered with total artistic commitment. After the children were in bed, Charles and Eudora sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and talked until well past the hour when she usually slept. And the conversation moved through territory she had not traveled with another person in a long time, territory about who they each were, what they had wanted, what had happened to those wants in the years of actually living. He told her about Colorado, where he had grown up on a horse ranch run by his father and his father's brother, and about the uncle's debts that had eventually taken the ranch, which was why he had come to Texas to build something of his own with the proceeds of the cattle he had driven south. She told him about Illinois, where she had grown up the daughter of a schoolteacher, and about Thomas, whom she had met when he came to work at her father's neighbor's farm and who had had a quality of stillness and purpose that she had found enormously attractive after a childhood surrounded by people who talked more than they did. "Do you miss Illinois?" Charles asked. "I miss the green," she said. "Texas is beautiful, but it is a brown and gold beauty. Illinois was green right down to the ground." "I miss the mountains," he said, "but you can't run cattle on a mountain." "You miss Colorado," she said. "Would you go back?" He was quiet for a moment. The lamp moved between them. "I don't think so," he said. "I think what I missed was the mountains and the air and the ranch that is gone, and going back would just be a different place with the same name." He looked at her. "I think what makes a place worth staying in is usually not the geography." She looked back at him, and the look held for a moment longer than it had before, and the kitchen was warm and the night outside the window was cold and full of stars, and Charles Cooper said, very quietly, "Eudora," just her name. Nothing attached to it, no question, no statement, just her name said in a voice that had something in it she recognized, because she had been hearing it in her own chest for weeks. "I know," she said, equally quietly. "I'm not going to rush anything," he said. "I want you to know that." "I know that too," she said, "but I want you to also know," he stopped and started again. "I want you to know that I am not going anywhere, that I am here in whatever capacity is right. That is all I am saying." She looked at her hands on the table and then she looked at him. "I am not the same person I was in August," she said honestly, "and I am not sure yet who I am becoming. I need you to understand that." "I do understand that," he said. "I am not asking you to be anyone particular. I am just asking to be in the vicinity while you figure it out." She was quiet for a long moment. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. Outside, the Texas night was huge and cold and full of possibilities. "Good night, Mr. Cooper," she said. "Good night, Mrs. Garrison," he said, and his voice was warm and careful and full of a patience that was its own kind of declaration. The winter moved through its gray middle months with the particular slowness that winters have in the West, the days short and flat, the work less urgent but never truly absent, the world contracted to what is immediately close. Eudora managed her farm with increasing confidence, making decisions about the livestock and the land that became each time a little more instinctive and a little less frightening. She kept one mare and had plans for the spring. Compass was in the barn and his presence was a daily comfort that she no longer tried to analyze. Charles came by on Saturdays and sometimes on Wednesdays, and they developed a pattern, a rhythm of presence and conversation that was not courtship in any formal or declared sense, but was building something nonetheless. The way a wall is built, stone by stone, without drama or announcement, simply becoming itself. In January, he took Nathaniel fishing at the creek that ran along the northeast corner of the Cooper property, which had been Nathaniel's expressed ambition since a conversation in December. And the two of them came back at dusk with cold cheeks, and 4 catfish and Nathaniel talking more rapidly and continuously than Eudora had heard him talk since before Thomas died. She stood on the porch and watched them come across the field together, the tall man and the small boy, and felt something break open in her chest that was not grief this time. It was something else entirely. That night after Charles had gone, she sat at the table in the quiet kitchen and let herself think about it plainly, without the safety of ambiguity. She thought about what it would mean, practically and emotionally. She thought about Nathaniel and Clara, who had, in their different ways, already made a decision that she had not yet consciously endorsed. She thought about Thomas, and she thought about the complicated question of whether loving someone new is a betrayal of someone gone, or simply a continuation of the life that grief had briefly interrupted. And she thought about it for a long time without coming to a conclusion, and she went to bed and slept better than she had slept in months. In February, on a clear cold afternoon when the sky was very blue and the frost was still on the grass in the shadows, Charles Cooper came to the farm with a post and rail that he said was for the paddock, and after he had said it and they were drinking coffee on the porch in their coats with the cold biting at the edges of everything, he said, without particular preamble, "I would like to court you properly, if you will allow it." She looked at him. The directness was so characteristic of him, so entirely without artifice. "Properly," she repeated. "I am aware that it is less than 6 months since you lost Thomas," he said. "I am aware that there are people in this town who will have opinions. I do not care about the latter and I want to honor the former. So I am asking, and if the answer is no or not yet, I will continue to come on Saturdays and fix fence posts and take Nathaniel fishing, and that is entirely all right. She looked at the yard, at the cottonwood trees that were just beginning to show the first hints of budding, at Compass moving in the paddock with his copper coat brilliant in the winter sun. She looked at her hands around the coffee mug. "Not yet," she said, and then, because she was an honest woman, "But not no," he let out a breath. "That is a fine answer," he said. "I am content with that." Spring came with a force and color that seemed personal, as if the land had decided to make an argument. The mesquite greened. The wildflowers arrived in the low places first and then spread across the hills in waves of blue and yellow and pale pink, and the air went from the thin, cold clarity of winter to something warm and complicated, full of smells and sound, full of the energy of things beginning. Eudora planted her kitchen garden in March. She started the winter wheat that Mr. Beale had told her would do well in the east field. She made arrangements with a neighbor 2 miles south to run a few cattle on her pasture in exchange for a share of the proceeds, which gave her a small steady income. The debt remaining after the court ruling was paid off by April, entirely in full, and she walked out of the bank in Millhaven that afternoon and stood on the sidewalk in the bright April sun and felt completely free for the first time in approximately 3 years. She went straight to the Cooper Ranch. She arrived unannounced in the late afternoon, rode up the cottonwood lane with the trees in full leaf above her, and found Charles at the paddock fence watching a mare work, his hat pushed back on his head and his arms on the top rail. He heard her approach and turned, and when he saw her face, she could not entirely control what was on her face, the relief and the joy of it. He straightened immediately. "What's happened?" he said. "The debt is paid," she said. "All of it. It is done." He looked at her for a moment, and the expression that moved across his face was something she had not quite seen before, something unguarded and deeply glad. "Eudora," he said. And she said, because it was spring and the cottonwoods were in leaf and the debt was paid and she had been not yet for 2 months and she was ready to be something else now, "Yes." He looked at her. "Yes. You asked in February if you could court me properly," she said. "The answer is yes." He came away from the paddock fence and stood in front of her, and she was still on Amos, who was mildly offended at having been ridden fast on a warm day, and Charles looked up at her with those dark, serious eyes and said, "You are certain?" "I am not a woman who says things she is uncertain about," she said. He put his hand up to help her down from the mule, and she took it. And when her feet were on the ground, she was standing very close to him, and the spring air was all around them, and she could see the silver in his hair and the lines around his eyes, and the way his expression had gone entirely open, entirely present, the most unguarded she had ever seen him. He brought her hand up very carefully and pressed his lips to the back of it, a gesture so old-fashioned and so sincere that it went straight through every one of her defenses and landed exactly where it was aimed. "Then we'll do this right," he said. They did it right. He came to take her to church on Sundays, which in Millhaven in 1878 was as public a declaration as a man could make. And the town watched and discussed and ultimately approved, because Charles Cooper was a known and respected man, and Eudora Garrison was a known and respected woman, and there was a general feeling that Thomas would have had the sense to appreciate that his wife was not going to spend the rest of her life alone at 40 acres with 2 children and a leaking roof. Even if the roof was now fixed. He took her to dinner at the hotel on a Friday evening in May, and she wore the blue dress she had bought before Thomas died and had not worn since, and she was conscious of herself in a new and slightly unsteady way, conscious of being looked at and of looking, of the particular charged quality of sitting across a table from a person who is becoming something to you by the minute. They talked about everything. They talked about the farm and the ranch and the spring planting and the cattle market and the weather. They talked about books and discovered that they both had read and loved the same novel, a thing that felt like a coincidence too specific to be entirely random. They talked about Nathaniel, who wanted to become a veterinarian, an ambition Charles took seriously and encouraged, and about Clara, whose personality was continuing to expand in all directions like a warm gas, filling every available space. He told her more about his father, who had been a stubborn, proud, sometimes difficult man whom Charles had loved with the complicated love of a son who recognizes his own stubbornness in a parent. She told him more about Thomas, and he listened in the way she had come to appreciate, without discomfort or displacement, simply present to the fact of who she had been and what she had lost. "I do not want you to feel that you are in competition with a memory," she said over dessert directly, because she believed in addressing difficult things directly. "I don't," he said, equally directly. "I know who Thomas was to you. I know that is real and will always be real. I am not trying to replace something. I am hoping to be something new." She looked at him across the white cloth of the hotel table with the candlelight between them, and felt something she had been trying to give only careful, managed amounts of room, felt it take up more space than she had been allowing. "You already are," she said quietly. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and they sat like that for a moment in the warm yellow light, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. He kissed her for the first time in May, on the porch of the farmhouse on a Sunday evening after church dinner, when the children were inside already and the sky was deep blue and the first stars were coming out, and the air smelled of sage and apple blossoms from the tree Thomas had planted near the fence. She had been expecting it and also not expecting it, in the way of things that are approaching and still manage to arrive with a quality of surprise. It was brief and gentle and entirely right, and she stood with her hands at her sides and her heart loud in her ears and looked at him afterward, and he looked at her with an expression that was both steady and somewhat awed, and she reached up and touched the silver at his temple once, a gesture she had been wanting to make for months, and he turned his face briefly into her hand like compass had pressed into her palm in the barn on that first morning. And it was a gesture that she thought she would remember for the rest of her life. Summer arrived in Texas the way it always did, with authority and commitment, the temperature climbing hard through June into July and August, until the world was all dust and heat shimmer, and the extraordinary blue intensity of a cloudless western sky. The work on both properties was relentless and satisfying, the kind of work that uses your body entirely and makes you fall asleep at night with the specific contentment of having done something real. Charles and Eudora moved through their courtship with a deliberateness that came from being adults who had already seen what could go wrong, who did not take for granted the value of what was building between them. He spent Sunday afternoons at the farm, and she occasionally rode up to the Cooper Ranch on Saturdays, and there was an understanding between them that was not yet engaged, but was moving in that direction with the steady, unhurried confidence of something that knows where it is going. Nathaniel had quietly adopted Charles into the architecture of his life, with the pragmatic thoroughness of a child who has identified a need and found a solution. He showed Charles things on the farm and asked his advice, and listened to him talk about horses with an attention that he had previously reserved exclusively for books, which Eudora found both deeply moving and slightly alarming. Clara had simply decided, with the sovereign confidence of a 5-year-old who had recently turned 6, that Charles Cooper was her particular person, and treated him accordingly, which meant he was subject to her opinions and songs and questions, and the occasional tyrannical demand in equal measure, and he bore all of it with an equanimity that told Eudora more about his character than almost anything else. In August, on the first anniversary of Thomas's death, Eudora went alone to the churchyard in the morning and sat beside the grave for a long time in the warm, early air, talking to Thomas in the way you talk to the dead when you need them to understand something. She told him about the children who were well and growing. She told him about the farm, which was doing better than it had any right to. She told him about the court case and Jacob Pruitt's comeuppance, which she thought Thomas would have found satisfying. She told him about Charles Cooper. She sat with that for a while in the August morning quiet. She believed that Thomas would have liked Charles. She believed this not as a consolation but as an honest assessment, because Thomas had had a strong sense of character, a quick recognition of integrity in other people, and Charles Cooper was nothing if not a man of integrity. She believed that Thomas would have said, in the particular way he had had of saying serious things simply, that she should be happy, and that he would have meant it. She went home and made a special dinner for the children, Thomas's favorites, and they talked about him openly and honestly, the way she had always wanted them to be able to talk about him. And Nathaniel cried a little, and Clara asked very specific questions about where exactly heaven was and what the weather was like there, and it was a true and good evening. She told Charles about it on Sunday. He listened without filling the silence with reassurance or deflection, just listened, and when she was finished he said, "He sounds like he was a very good man." "He was," she said. "He really was." And there was room in that for everything it needed to contain. Charles asked her to marry him in September, a full year after the auction. He did not do it dramatically or publicly. He came on a Saturday morning and found her in the garden, staking up the last of the tomatoes before the first frost came, and he stood at the garden gate for a moment watching her, and she looked up and saw him and brushed the soil off her hands, and he said, without ceremony, "I would like to marry you, Eudora, if you will have me. I am asking you to marry me." She stood in the garden with soil on her hands and her hair slightly escaping its pins from the work, and she looked at him with the full force of everything she had learned about him in a year, everything she had watched him be when he thought no one was paying particular attention, which was precisely the same person he was when he knew he was being observed. "I want a few things understood," she said. "Tell me," he said. "The farm is mine," she said, "legally and in practice. I do not stop making decisions about it. Of course," he said, "the children keep Thomas's name until and unless they themselves choose otherwise when they are old enough to choose." "Absolutely," he said. "I'm not trying to replace their father. I'm hoping to be an addition. And you will tell me things," she said. "When something is wrong or difficult or uncertain, you will tell me and not protect me from it." He looked at her steadily. "I will tell you," he said. "I promise that." She looked at him for a long moment in the September garden, with the tomatoes and the late-season flowers and the September sky above them, that blue and gold and infinite. She thought about the auction. She thought about the coffee in the kitchen. She thought about the porch in the morning and the fence posts and the catfish and the Christmas chicken and the April afternoon when the debt was paid. She thought about a kiss in May and a hand reached across a white tablecloth and 100 small moments that were each on their own nothing very large and together were everything. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He came through the garden gate and took both her soul-covered hands in his and held them, and the expression on his face was the most completely unguarded she had ever seen it, something that was not quite composure and was entirely beautiful. "Good," he said. "That is very good." She laughed, that real genuine laugh he had first heard at Christmas, and he laughed too, and they stood in the September garden in the particular joy of two people who have done something right. They were married in November, on a Saturday that was clear and cold with a sky so blue it seemed almost improbable, in the Millhaven church with the whole town present, because the whole town had been following the proceedings with great interest since the previous October, and was not about to miss the conclusion. The church was full of November chrysanthemums that Clara had personally insisted upon, having developed opinions about flowers since the spring. Nathaniel stood with Charles as a kind of informal second, a role that had not been discussed, but that the boy had positioned himself in with quiet authority, and Clara walked ahead of her mother scattering flower petals with a seriousness of purpose that made several people in the pews dab their eyes. Eudora walked down the aisle in a dress the color of winter cream, her dark hair pinned with the ribbon that had been Charles's Christmas gift almost a year ago, and she looked at Charles standing at the front of the church with his good coat and his serious, open face, and she felt the particular quality of certainty that comes not from absence of doubt, but from having looked at all the doubts clearly and found them insufficient. The ceremony was brief and direct, as they had both agreed it should be, the words plain and the meaning entirely clear. When the minister said to Charles, "Do you take this woman?" Charles said yes with a conviction that made the word sound like a whole sentence. When he said to Eudora, "Do you take this man?" Eudora said yes in a voice that was quiet and steady and absolutely certain. And Charles's face did the thing it had done in the September garden, that complete unguardedness. And she thought she would give a great deal to preserve this particular moment. The reception was at the church hall with food that half the women of Millhaven had contributed, which in practice meant an extraordinary abundance of casseroles and pies, and dancing to the fiddle of a man named Rays who could play for 4 hours without stopping, and whose rhythm was consistently perfect. Charles danced with Eudora until she was breathless and laughing, and then with Clara, who stood on his feet the entire time and directed operations, and then with Mrs. Finch, who had been instrumental to Eudora's survival in the past year, and deserved to be danced with. Nathaniel danced once with a girl from his school class with the rigid dignity of a boy who has been told to be polite, and is giving it everything he has. Fletcher Hale was there, and drank a glass of whiskey, and made a toast that was precise and genuinely moving. Sibo, the ranch hand, who had become something like a fixture in their combined household, sat in the corner and told stories to a group of children who were supposed to be asleep. Even Mrs. Alderman, who had been one of the opinion havers during the courtship, was there, and had the grace to appear genuinely happy. It was a very good party. They went home to the Cooper ranch that night, which was now their ranch, a decision they had made together over the summer because the Cooper property was larger and better resourced, and could absorb the Garrison farm's livestock and equipment, while Eudora kept title to the 40 acres east of town, and had plans to lease the farmland to a young family from Kansas who were moving into the territory and needed ground to start on. The farmhouse would give the Hendersons a roof and Eudora an income from the lease, and the arrangement satisfied her sense of independence as well as her practical sense. The children had settled into the Cooper house over several visits through the fall, their possessions arriving in stages, their routines adapting with the resilience of children whose essential security is intact. Nathaniel had the room overlooking the paddock, which delighted him. Clara had the room next to the kitchen, which she had chosen because she could hear everything, which was essential to her nature. That first night of their marriage, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, they sat at the kitchen table together the way they had sat on the first morning, with coffee between them, and Eudora looked around the kitchen that was now hers as much as his and felt the strangeness and the rightness of it simultaneously. "How does it feel?" Charles asked quietly. "Strange," she said honestly, "and right, both at once." "That seems correct," he said. She looked at him across the table, this man with the dark eyes and the silver temples and the specific quality of attention that had been the first thing she had recognized in him, and felt a wave of something so large and warm and complete that it was almost frightening. "Charles," she said. "Eudora," he said, matching her tone. "I love you," she said plainly, because she was a woman who said things plainly. "I want you to know that." He set his coffee mug down very deliberately, and he reached across the table and took her hand, and he looked at her with everything he was and said, "I love you. I have loved you since somewhere around the first cup of coffee in this kitchen, which felt unreasonably fast, and I was not prepared for it." She laughed. She covered her mouth with her free hand and laughed, and he laughed too, and the kitchen was warm and the night outside was full of November stars, and it was enormously, simply, entirely good. The first year of their marriage was full in the way that good years are full, crowded with the ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure. They worked the ranch together, and Eudora found that running a larger operation with a partner was a fundamentally different thing from managing 40 acres alone, not because the work was less, but because there was someone to think through the problems with, someone to share the good days and the difficult ones, someone who brought a different perspective to the same set of facts and was genuinely interested in hers. Compass lived in the best stall in the barn and was ridden by both of them, but he was fundamentally Eudora's horse. She rode him in the early mornings, before the household was fully awake, taking long circuits of the property in the cold, clear air, and these rides became the most peaceful part of her day, a time that was entirely her own, and she was grateful for the husband who understood this about her. In March, the mare she had kept from the Garrison farm foaled, a small dark colt she named after Thomas because it was the right thing to do. Thomas the colt was going to be a spectacular horse. You could see it already in his proportions and his way of moving, and Charles said so honestly and with genuine admiration for the blood that had produced him. In April, Eudora realized she was expecting. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days before she told Charles, not from doubt or uncertainty, but because she wanted to know it herself first, to hold it privately for a moment before it became shared, because she had learned that she needed these small private moments of prior knowing. When she told him on a Wednesday evening after the children were in bed, sitting on the porch in the spring dark, his response was silence first, the specific silence of a person absorbing something important, and then he put his arm around her and pulled her close and said, with his mouth against her hair, "Are you all right?" "Very," she said. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Extremely," she said. He held her closer, and the spring night was around them, and the frogs were starting their season in the creek, and it was a moment of such complete contentment that she tried to hold on to the exact feeling of it the way you try to hold water in your hands. Nathaniel received the news with characteristic solemnity, asking several practical questions about logistics and sleeping arrangements with the gravity of a boy who has decided he is the household's operational manager. Clara received it with uncomplicated delight and immediately began composing a list of names, none of which were going to be used but all of which she delivered with full conviction. The pregnancy progressed through the summer without serious difficulty, and the ranch continued its work, and the Hendersons on the leased farmland were good neighbors who kept the property well and occasionally brought over a pie, and the summer wheat came in better than expected, and the cattle prices were fair, and there was something in the sustained goodness of that year that felt both fragile and earned. Their son was born in December, on a cold night when the stars were brilliant and particular over the Texas plains, and the fire in the bedroom was as bright as Eudora could want it. Mrs. Finch attended along with the midwife, and Charles sat in the kitchen and drank more coffee than was advisable, and was absolutely no use to anyone but was very present, which was what he could offer. The baby was strong and loud, and arrived with the definitive opinion about his own existence that some people are simply born with. He had dark hair and Charles's coloring, and he weighed 8 pounds and 3 ounces, and he looked, as Nathaniel observed with scientific interest, like a very surprised person. They named him Jacob Thomas Cooper, Jacob for Charles's father who had been stubborn and proud, and had loved his son well despite his faults, and Thomas for Thomas Garrison, who had bred compass and built the east fence and loved Eudora and the children, and whose presence in their family's story was permanent and honored. Charles held his son for the first time in the cold December bedroom with the firelight on them both, and the expression on his face was something Eudora had not seen before, a tenderness so complete it was almost overwhelming to look at, and she reached over from the bed and put her hand on his arm. "Hello, Jacob," Charles said to the baby, very quietly, as if not wanting to startle him. "I have been waiting for you." Clara, who had been allowed to stay up for the occasion, leaned over from her position at the edge of the bed to get a better look at her new brother and announced that he had a satisfactory nose. Nathaniel stood by the door with his arms crossed and his face carefully composed, and Eudora saw his chin wobble once and then steady, and she thought, with a wave of love so sharp it was almost pain, how much he looked like Thomas at that moment. "Come here, Nathaniel," she said. He came and sat beside her, and she put her arm around him, and he leaned into her in the way he still allowed himself to do when no one outside the family was watching, and they looked at Charles holding the baby together. "We are a good family," Nathaniel said, with the definitive tone of a person stating a fact. "We are," Eudora agreed. Charles looked over at them both and smiled, and it was the full smile, the one that made him look young and entirely himself, the one she had been trying to earn since the first morning in the barn, and she smiled back at him across the fire-lit room, across their children, across everything that had happened and been built, and it was more than she had known to want. The years that followed in Millhaven were good years, not without difficulty because no years are without difficulty, but good in the fundamental sense, rich with the texture of a life built by two people who had each looked clearly at what they were getting into and chosen it fully. Compass lived well into his 20s, remarkable for a horse but not surprising for one who had been handled with Thomas Garrison's patience, and then maintained with Charles Cooper's care. Eudora rode him on the mornings that she could, right up until his age made the long rides inadvisable, and when he finally died in his stall on a winter morning, she went out alone and sat with him in the hay for an hour and felt the long, complete shape of that grief, which was for the horse and for Thomas, and for the October day of the auction, and for the woman she had been standing behind the fence post, not knowing that everything was about to change. Charles found her there and sat with her without a word, and after a while she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the cold barn together. And she thought about how strange and full this life had become, how far it had traveled from where she had imagined it would go. Thomas the colt became Thomas the horse, and then Thomas the sire, and produced a line of horses that Nathaniel, who did become a veterinarian with Charles's quiet and consistent encouragement, was still tracing 20 years later. Jacob grew into a boy who was like his father in his steadiness, and like his mother in his directness, and who decided by the age of 10 that he was going to run the Cooper Ranch, an ambition both his parents found both alarming and entirely believable. Clara, who had grown from a 5-year-old with opinions about hens and flower colors into a young woman with opinions about everything, married a schoolteacher from Abilene at the age of 22, a man she chose with the same sovereign confidence with which she had chosen everything, and who was clearly somewhat awed by her, which Eudora thought was probably the correct response. The town of Millhaven grew, as Western towns do in that era, growing and then sometimes contracting and then growing again, and Jacob Prout left sometime in 1880 under circumstances that Fletcher Hale described as professionally inevitable, and Fletcher Hale himself became a circuit judge in 1883 and handed down rulings that were known for being both precise and fair. The Hendersons on the leased farmland eventually bought it outright from Eudora in 1885 at a price she named, and he accepted without negotiation, and she put the money into improvements on the ranch that Charles had been wanting to make, and which she had wanted to make as a gift rather than a joint expenditure, because after 7 years, she still believed in keeping the lines between them clean and the accounts honest. On a September morning in 1886, 8 years almost to the day from the morning she had ridden up the Cottonwood Lane on Amos the mule with her heart hammering and her speech prepared, Eudora Cooper sat on the front porch of her ranch house in the early light with her coffee, and watched the sun come up over the mesquite plains, and felt the particular quality of a life that has fully arrived at itself. Charles came out and sat in the chair beside her with his own coffee, his hair fully silver now and his face more lined but his dark eyes exactly as they had always been, attentive and steady and entirely present. He had been awake early looking at Jacob, who had a minor cold and had woken twice in the night, and the particular quality of a father who has been up with a sick child was in his movements, tired and entirely without complaint. They sat in the morning quiet and drank their coffee and watched the sun lift over the plains. "I have been thinking about something," Eudora said. "Tell me," he said. "I have been thinking about the auction," she said. "About what it would have been like if someone else had bought Compass. If you had been outbid by Fowler from Abilene, or if you had not been there at all." He was quiet for a moment, considering this with the honest seriousness he brought to everything. You still would have found out about Prout, he said. Eventually. Maybe, she said, but maybe not. Maybe I would have lost the farm. You are very stubborn, he said. I think you would have found a way. I am not sure I would have found the same way, she said, and she looked at him with the full weight of 8 years between them. 8 years of mornings and evenings and arguments and laughter and children and work and grief and joy, and all the ordinary, extraordinary substance of a life lived alongside another person. He looked back at her. No, he said, not the same way. She reached across and took his hand, the way she had taken his hand on that first October morning in the barn, and he held it in his calloused, careful, familiar grip, and the morning light came across the porch, and the plains were wide and gold around them, and the cottonwood trees were turning again, the way they turned every year, ordinary and beautiful and reliable, and Eudora Cooper sat in the chair beside the man she loved and thought that of all the extraordinary things in this strange, good life, the thing she was most grateful for was the particular ordinary magic of a Tuesday morning, a cup of coffee, and his hand in hers. Nathaniel came out of the barn, 23 now and tall in a way that was still slightly new, leading his horse with the ease of someone who has been handling horses since he was 7, and he lifted a hand to them both on the porch in the easy greeting of a person at home in his world. Jacob appeared at the screen door behind them, 8 years old and emphatically not sick enough to stay in bed despite his cold, and Clara's last letter from Abilene was on the kitchen table waiting to be answered, and it was funny and long and full of her particular voice, unchanged since she was 6 years old, and explaining the egg-laying theories of hens. The morning was full and clear and the day would be long and good. I am going to ride out and check the east pasture after breakfast, Eudora said. I'll come with you, Charles said. You don't have to, she said. I know, he said. I want to. She turned and looked at him in the morning light, and he looked at her in the complete and honest way he always had, the way that had been the first thing she had recognized in him on that first morning in the barn when she had walked in prepared to argue and had found instead something entirely different. Something she had not been looking for and had not known she needed, something that had proven to be the foundation of everything that followed. She squeezed his hand. All right, she said. Come with me. And the morning opened up before them, wide and clear and entirely theirs.